couldn't believe I was dying in the back of an ambulance, watching my own blood soak through the paramedics' gloves, and the only thing I could think about was whether my 7-year-old twins would remember me. But what happened next exposed a truth so shocking, so deeply humiliating, that it made nearly dying feel like the easy part. You think you know your family until you're lying there with internal bleeding, begging your own parents to pick up your children from school for just a few hours while surgeons try to save your life, and they tell you no because they have front row seats to see Adele, and your sister's been looking forward to this for months. The betrayal hit harder than the SUV that crushed my ribcage, and in that moment of absolute vulnerability, I saw my entire life with crystal clarity. 8 years of sacrifice, $387,000 in payments, countless missed moments with my own children while I funded their lifestyle, and I realized I'd been paying for the privilege of being treated like a burden instead of a daughter. The infidelity wasn't romantic. It was familial, a systematic cheating of my love and loyalty by people who saw me as nothing more than an ATM with a heartbeat and a dangerous habit of actually needing something back. They lied about caring, cheated me out of dignity, and when I finally stopped writing checks, they launched a campaign to convince everyone I was mentally unstable, that my accusations were delusions, that the strong, capable daughter they'd exploited for nearly a decade had suddenly snapped under pressure. What I didn't know then was that someone had been watching all of it, and the truth was already sharpening its knives. My name is Emma. I'm 36 years old, and this is the story of how I was humiliated at my lowest moment, mocked through whispered family gossip, shamed for having the audacity to stop funding my own invisibility, and how the truth, when finally revealed in front of 60 witnesses at a birthday party, destroyed my family's carefully constructed lies in less than 15 minutes. This isn't about revenge, though some might call it that. This is about what happens when you reclaim your self-worth from people who've been renting it back to you at an impossible price. When you choose dignity over acceptance. When you finally understand that the most shocking betrayal isn't what they did to you, but what you allowed them to keep doing long after you should have walked away. I'm 36 years old, a cardiology resident at Chicago Memorial, and the single mother of 7-year-old twins named Sophie and Daniel. I thought I knew what exhaustion felt like after those brutal 72-hour hospital shifts. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment my entire world shattered on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was driving home from the hospital when this SUV ran a red light and slammed into my driver's side. And the next thing I remember is waking up in an ambulance with a paramedic telling me I was bleeding internally and needed emergency surgery immediately. The pain was unbearable, but what terrified me most wasn't dying. It was the thought of my babies coming home from school to an empty house with no one there to hold them. I managed to grab my phone with trembling, blood-stained fingers and called my parents. My voice barely a whisper as I begged them to please pick up Sophie and Daniel from school and watch them for just a few hours while the surgeons tried to save my life. There was this long, horrible pause on the other end, and then my mother's voice came through, cold and irritated, saying they couldn't possibly help because they had plans they'd been looking forward to for months. Front row seats to see Adele in concert with my younger sister, Victoria. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Lying there in that ambulance with sirens screaming around me. And I thought maybe the blood loss was making me hallucinate, because surely my own parents wouldn't choose a concert over their daughter's life and their grandchildren's safety. But then my father got on the line and said something that would haunt me forever. Emma, you always figure things out. You're the strong one, and frankly, we're tired of you creating drama every time you need something. This is our special night with Victoria, and we're not letting you ruin it again. The betrayal hit harder than the car that nearly killed me. And as the paramedic increased my morphine drip, I felt this strange clarity wash over me through the pain. 8 years of sacrifice. 8 years of being the dependable one. The one who always showed up. The one who paid their mortgage when Dad lost his job. Who covered Mom's medical insurance. Who wrote check after check while they lavished attention and money on Victoria. All of it came crashing down in that moment. I had to call my neighbor, a sweet elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who barely spoke English. And somehow, through my tears and her broken sentences, she understood and promised to get my babies from school. As they wheeled me into surgery, I remember looking at the harsh fluorescent lights above me, and making a decision that would change everything. I was done being the family ATM, done being treated like a burden instead of a daughter, done sacrificing my dignity for people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of payback for raising me. The anesthesiologist asked me to count backwards from 10, and somewhere around 7, I realized that the old Emma died in that ambulance, and whoever woke up from this surgery would be someone entirely different. The surgery took 6 hours, and when I finally opened my eyes in recovery, the first face I saw wasn't my mother or father. It was Mrs. Chen, holding Sophie's hand while Daniel slept in the chair beside my bed. My children had been terrified, confused about why Grandma and Grandpa weren't there, and I had to lie through my teeth and tell them that their grandparents were stuck in traffic, because how do you explain to 7-year-olds that their family values concert tickets over their mother's life? Something inside me shifted in that hospital room, something fundamental and irreversible, and I knew that the truth about my family's cruelty would eventually come out in ways they never saw coming. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Victoria, not asking if I was alive, not apologizing for the betrayal, but complaining that I had guilt-tripped our parents during their special night and ruined the Adele concert vibe because Mom kept checking her phone worried about what people would think if they found out. That's when I understood with perfect clarity that this wasn't just about one refused favor or one moment of selfishness. This was the revelation of who they truly were, who they'd always been, and I had just been too busy playing the role of the dutiful daughter to see it. The humiliation burned through me like acid, but underneath it, something colder and sharper was beginning to take shape, something that would eventually bring justice in ways my family never imagined possible. Lying in that hospital bed with surgical drains still attached to my abdomen, I started doing something I'd avoided for years. I pulled up my banking app and began scrolling through 8 years of transaction history. The numbers that appeared on that screen made me physically nauseous, and it wasn't the pain medication causing it. $387,000. That's how much I'd transferred to my parents over the years, and seeing it calculated in cold, hard digits made the betrayal feel suffocatingly real. I'd paid their mortgage for 42 consecutive months when Dad's temporary setback turned into early retirement, covered Mom's health insurance premiums every single quarter, and wired emergency funds so many times I'd lost count, all while raising twins alone on a resident salary that barely covered our own rent. The worst part wasn't just the money, though that wound cut deep enough. It was the realization that every sacrifice had been invisible to them, treated like something I owed, rather than something I chose to give out of love. I remembered calling Mom excited about Sophie's first piano recital, only to have her cut me off mid-sentence to gush about Victoria's new photography hobby that they'd just spent $6,000 funding. I remembered Dad missing both twins' birthday parties 3 years running because Victoria needed help moving apartments, redecorating her condo, or dealing with whatever crisis she'd manufactured that week. The pattern had always been there, woven through every family dinner and holiday gathering, but I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid or overly sensitive. Turns out I was just being gaslit. What really destroyed me was remembering all those times I'd defended them to my friends, made excuses for their absence, rationalized their coldness as generational differences or different love languages. My best friend Rachel had called it years ago after watching them fawn over Victoria's mediocre art show while barely acknowledging that I'd just completed a prestigious cardiology fellowship. She'd looked at me with such pity and said, "Emma, you're not their daughter. You're their backup plan, their safety net, their ATM with a heartbeat." I'd gotten angry at her that night, accused her of not understanding complex family dynamics, but lying in that hospital bed with tubes running out of my body and my parents at a concert, I finally understood she'd been trying to save me from exactly this moment. The financial exploitation was brutal, but the emotional neglect was what truly broke something inside me that couldn't be repaired. I pulled up old text messages and read through them with fresh eyes. Every conversation where I'd shared my struggles as a single mother was met with dismissive responses or immediate redirections to Victoria's latest drama. When I'd told them I was exhausted from working double shifts while potty training twins, Mom had responded with 3 paragraphs about how Victoria was really struggling with her Instagram engagement rates. When I'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed and isolated, Dad had sent back a thumbs-up emoji and then asked if I could cover their car insurance payment that month because they wanted to take Victoria on a spa weekend to help her de-stress. I took screenshots of everything, every transaction, every cold message, every receipt from the life I'd been funding while my own children wore hand-me-downs, and I drove a car with 200,000 miles on it. My hands were shaking as I created a folder on my phone labeled The Truth, because some part of me already knew this evidence would matter eventually, that karma was preparing something bigger than I could imagine. The nurses kept asking if I needed more pain medication, but the ache in my chest had nothing to do with the surgery and everything to do with grieving the family I'd thought I had, mourning the parents who existed only in my desperate imagination. By the time they discharged me 4 days later, I'd made a decision that felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. I was done funding my own invisibility, done paying for the privilege of being treated like an inconvenience. I blocked my parents' access to my Venmo, removed them from my bank's quick transfer list, and changed my phone settings so their calls would go straight to voicemail. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was also revealing, because it took them exactly 9 days to notice I'd stopped being their personal piggy bank. Not one message asking how I was recovering, just Dad's angry voicemail demanding to know why their mortgage payment had bounced, and accusing me of being vindictive and immature. 2 weeks after I stopped the money transfers, my phone started blowing up with calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Cousins, aunts, even my mom's book club friends, all asking if I was okay in that patronizing tone that really meant, "We heard you're losing it." Apparently, my parents had launched a full-scale campaign to discredit me, spreading whispers throughout the family that I was having some kind of mental breakdown, that the stress of single motherhood had finally pushed me over the edge. My Aunt Karen called crying, begging me to get help, because Mom had told her I'd become paranoid and delusional, making up wild stories about being neglected and inventing financial records that didn't exist. The gaslighting was so sophisticated, so calculated, that I actually started questioning my own memory for about 10 minutes before I remembered I had 8 years of bank statements that proved every single word. Victoria took to social media like a grief-stricken sister, posting vague messages about family members who create drama for attention and the heartbreak of watching someone you love self-destruct. She'd captioned a throwback photo of us as kids, with something about how she'd always be there for me despite my recent struggles with reality, and the comments section filled up with people sending prayers and suggesting therapy referrals. I watched my reputation crumble in real time, watched relatives I'd helped financially over the years suddenly treat me like I was made of glass and delusion. My mother even called my hospital, pretending to be concerned, asking if there was someone she could speak with about my mental state, and whether the head trauma from the accident might have caused personality changes. She was literally trying to build a medical paper trail to support their lies. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They weren't just cutting me off emotionally. They were systematically destroying my credibility, so that when the truth eventually came out, no one would believe me. Dad sent an email to several family members expressing concern about my increasingly erratic behavior and my unfounded accusations, painting himself as the worried father dealing with a troubled daughter who'd become obsessed with perceived slights. He even suggested that my demanding job and single parenthood had created a persecution complex, where I saw betrayal everywhere, conveniently forgetting that I had receipts for every single dollar, every ignored phone call, every dismissive text message. The backstabbed feeling was visceral and constant, like walking around with a knife between my shoulder blades that I couldn't reach to remove. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that I wasn't alone in seeing through their manipulation. My grandfather, my dad's father, was a retired federal judge named Henry Morrison who'd spent 40 years seeing through liars in courtrooms across Texas. He called me one afternoon, his voice steady and clear despite his 82 years, and said 5 words that changed everything. "I know what they're doing." Turns out Grandpa Henry had been watching this family dynamic play out for years, had seen how they treated me versus Victoria, had noticed the financial exploitation even when I'd been too close to see it myself. He told me he'd tried talking to my father about it multiple times, but Dad had always dismissed his concerns, claiming I preferred to be independent, and that helping me would hurt my pride. Grandpa Henry asked me to send him everything, every bank statement, every text message, every piece of evidence I'd collected in my hospital bed. And I did, watching as gigabytes of truth uploaded to his secure email. He called me back 3 hours later, and I could hear the rage in his voice, that quiet fury that comes from a man who'd spent his life pursuing justice, watching his own son commit such calculated cruelty. He told me he was planning his 80th birthday party for the following month, a big family gathering he'd been postponing for years, and he wanted me there with Sophie and Daniel. He wanted everyone there. The way he said it made my spine tingle, like I was watching a chess master position pieces on a board that no one else could see yet, setting up a move that would expose everything. I started sleeping better after that conversation, even as the rumors intensified and more family members distanced themselves from me, even as Victoria posted another passive-aggressive quote about toxic people who play the victim. There was something deeply comforting about knowing that someone with power and moral authority saw the truth, that I wasn't crazy or dramatic or delusional. I was simply a daughter who'd been exploited and then discredited when she'd finally said enough. The humiliation still burned. The shamed feeling still kept me up some nights. But underneath it all was this growing sense of anticipation, this knowledge that karma was loading in the chamber, and my family had no idea what was coming. The invitation to Grandpa Henry's birthday party arrived in my mailbox on thick, expensive cardstock, the kind that meant this wasn't just some casual backyard barbecue, but a formal event that demanded attendance. My mother called me for the first time in 3 weeks, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, saying how important it was that I be there because Grandpa specifically requested my presence and, you know how he gets at his age. I almost laughed at the transparent manipulation. Suddenly I was worth contacting when it served their purposes, when my absence might look bad in front of the extended family. I told her I'd be there with the twins, and I could practically hear her relief through the phone, probably thinking she'd successfully bullied me back into submission, back into playing the role of the quiet, compliant daughter who never made waves. What none of them knew was that Grandpa Henry had been preparing for this moment like a prosecutor building an ironclad case, spending weeks organizing my financial records into a presentation that would leave no room for doubt or deflection. He'd called me twice to verify specific transactions, to confirm dates and amounts, to make absolutely certain that every number could be backed up with documentation that even the most skeptical relative couldn't dismiss. He told me during one of those calls that he'd spent 40 years watching guilty people try to talk their way out of evidence, and he knew exactly how my parents would react when confronted with truth. They'd deny, deflect, and attack, which is precisely why he was planning to do this in front of witnesses who couldn't be gaslit or manipulated after the fact. The week before the party, Victoria posted a series of Instagram stories about family healing and how she was so grateful that I was finally getting the help I needed and coming back to reality. She was already writing the narrative of my redemption, positioning herself as the patient, loving sister who'd stood by me through my episode. My parents apparently told several relatives that I'd apologized privately for my accusations, and that they'd graciously forgiven my behavior because they understood I'd been under stress. The lies were piling up so high that I wondered how they kept track of them all, how they slept at night knowing they'd constructed an entire alternate reality to avoid accountability for their cruelty and greed. I spent hours picking out outfits for Sophie and Daniel, wanting them to look perfect, even though they had no idea why this party felt so significant, why my hands shook slightly as I pressed their clothes and polished their shoes. They were excited because Grandpa Henry always sneaked them extra dessert and told them stories about catching bad guys when he was a judge, and their innocence made my heart ache. They still believed family meant safety, that grandparents were supposed to protect you, that love wasn't something you had to purchase with your bank account. I looked at them bouncing around my bedroom, asking if they could bring Grandpa a drawing they'd made, and I realized this moment wasn't just about me reclaiming my dignity. It was about showing my children that self-worth matters, that boundaries matter, that you teach people how to treat you. Grandpa Henry called me the night before the party, his voice quieter than usual, asking if I was ready for what was about to happen. I told him I'd been ready since that ambulance ride, since the moment I understood that my family's love had always been conditional on my usefulness, my silence, my willingness to be exploited without complaint. He warned me that what he was planning would fracture the family permanently, that some relationships couldn't survive this kind of public reckoning, and I needed to be certain this was what I wanted. I thought about Sophie and Daniel, about the example I was setting, about whether I wanted them growing up thinking it was normal to accept cruelty from people who claim to love you, and I told Grandpa to do what needed to be done, that the truth deserved to be spoken regardless of who it made uncomfortable. The morning of the party, I stood in front of my mirror in a navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion. Simple, elegant, dignified. And I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. There was something different in my eyes, something harder and clearer than the desperate-to-please daughter who'd spent 8 years funding her own invisibility. I thought about all those checks I'd written, all those sacrifices I'd made, all those times I'd swallowed my hurt to keep the peace, and I felt this surge of something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite peace. It was justice, pure and simple, the knowledge that lies eventually collapse under the weight of documented truth, and that karma had been taking notes this whole time. The party was held at Grandpa Henry's sprawling ranch-style home outside Austin, with white tents set up across the lawn, and enough seating for the 60-plus relatives who'd traveled from 3 states to celebrate his 80th birthday. I arrived with Sophie and Daniel, and immediately felt the shift in energy as my parents spotted me. Mom's smile frozen in that pageant queen way she'd perfected. Dad's eyes narrowing like he was calculating whether my presence would cause problems he'd have to manage. Victoria rushed over with her phone already positioned for a selfie, playing the devoted sister role for her Instagram followers, gushing loudly about how amazing I looked and how glad she was that I'd worked through everything, code for, "Thank God you've accepted your place and stopped making us look bad." The first hour felt like walking through a minefield where everyone was watching me for signs of the instability my parents had advertised. Relatives approaching with cautious hugs and carefully worded questions about my health and stress levels. Aunt Karen actually asked if I was taking anything to help with my nerves, and I watched my mother across the lawn, nodding sympathetically to a cluster of cousins, probably reinforcing whatever story she'd fed them about my mental state. I smiled through it all, made small talk about the twins' school performance, accepted condolences about my accident that came 4 weeks too late, and I waited, because Grandpa Henry had told me exactly when the reckoning would come, right after the cake and the birthday toasts when everyone was gathered and comfortable and unsuspecting. Grandpa Henry stood up at exactly 3:15, tapping his glass with a fork, and the conversations died down as 60 pairs of eyes turned toward the patriarch who'd summoned them all here. He started with the expected gratitude, thanking everyone for coming, for celebrating 8 decades of life, for being the family that mattered most to him. And I watched my father relax slightly, probably thinking this would just be another sentimental old man speech about legacy and love. But then Grandpa's tone shifted, hardened into that courtroom voice I'd heard him use on conference calls with lawyers, and he said something that made the entire party freeze. "Before we continue celebrating, there's something I need to address about truth, family, and the consequences of exploitation disguised as love." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the breeze moving through the tent fabric, the distant sound of kids playing on the swing set, the sudden rapid breathing of my mother as she realized this wasn't going according to script. Grandpa Henry pulled out a folder I recognized, the one I'd sent him filled with bank statements and screenshots, and he began reading numbers aloud with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. $387,000 over 8 years. He let that number hang in the air before breaking it down month by month, payment by payment, mortgage installments and insurance premiums and emergency transfers, all while his granddaughter worked 70-hour weeks as a medical resident and raised twin children alone. I watched the color drain from my father's face, watched Victoria's phone slowly lower as she realized her Instagram performance was about to be exposed as the fraud it always was. But Grandpa wasn't finished. He moved from financial exploitation to emotional abandonment, describing in devastating detail how my parents had refused to help during my emergency surgery, choosing concert tickets over their daughter's life and their grandchildren's terror. Then he did something I'll never forget. He pulled out his own phone and read aloud the text message my mother had sent me while I was in post-op recovery, the one where she'd complained about me ruining their special night. instead of asking if I'd survived. His voice cracked slightly on those words. This 80-year-old man who'd maintained composure through thousands of court cases, and that tiny break in his steady tone hit harder than any amount of shouting could have. The shock rippling through that crowd was palpable, physical, like watching people's perceptions shatter in real time as they understood the depth of cruelty that had been hidden behind my parents' carefully constructed facade. I sat perfectly still, holding Sophie's hand under the table while Daniel leaned against my shoulder, both twins confused by the tension, but sensing something monumental was happening. Across from me, my mother tried to interrupt, her mouth opening to probably launch into some defensive explanation, but Grandpa Henry held up one hand, that judicial gesture that had silenced countless courtrooms, and continued speaking. He talked about the smear campaign they'd launched when I'd stopped funding their lifestyle, the lies about my mental health, the systematic destruction of my reputation designed to discredit me before the truth could surface. He held up printouts of Victoria's social media posts, read aloud my father's email suggesting I had a persecution complex, exposed every manipulation tactic they'd deployed with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime identifying exactly this kind of behavior. And somewhere in the middle of his speech, I realized I wasn't humiliated anymore. I wasn't shamed. I was free, because the truth was finally visible and undeniable and devastating in its simple, documented clarity. The silence after Grandpa Henry finished speaking lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like hours. That horrible, suffocating quiet, where everyone was processing what they'd just heard, and trying to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the monsters who'd just been exposed. My mother was the first to crack, standing up so fast her chair tipped backward, her voice shrill and defensive as she started saying something about taking things out of context and not understanding the full story. But the words died in her throat when she looked around and saw the faces staring back at her. These weren't the sympathetic relatives who'd believed her lies about my mental breakdown. These were people who'd just heard documented evidence, who'd watched a respected federal judge methodically dismantle her narrative with receipts and bank statements that couldn't be explained away or reframed. My father tried a different approach, standing up with his hands raised in that placating gesture he used when he wanted to appear reasonable, starting to say something about family disagreements and two sides to every story. But Uncle James, Dad's own brother, cut him off mid-sentence. James stood up slowly, his face red with what I recognized as pure rage, and said in this quiet, dangerous voice that he'd loaned Dad $12,000 3 years ago for a supposed emergency, money that was never repaid, and now he was wondering what other lies had been fed to him over the years. It was like watching the first domino fall, because suddenly other relatives were speaking up. Aunt Marie mentioning the temporary help, with bills that turned permanent. Cousin David recalling the time Dad had borrowed his truck and returned it damaged without apology. A pattern of entitlement and exploitation that went far beyond just me. Victoria tried to salvage the situation by bursting into tears, that theatrical crying she'd perfected since childhood, where she'd sob just loudly enough to draw attention without ruining her makeup. But this time nobody rushed to comfort her. My cousin Jennifer, who'd been Victoria's best friend growing up, just stared at her with this look of disgusted recognition, probably remembering all the times Victoria had borrowed money or clothes or opportunities and never returned them. All the times she'd played victim when consequences caught up with her behavior. The social media posts about toxic family members suddenly looked like the projection they'd always been, and I watched Victoria's performance falter as she realized her usual tactics weren't working, that the audience had finally seen through the act she'd been running for 28 years. People started leaving, not dramatically, not with announcements, just quiet departures where relatives would catch my eye with these apologetic looks before gathering their families and heading toward their cars. My mother tried to stop a few of them, grabbing arms and demanding they stay and hear her side, but they pulled away from her touch like she was contaminated, like the lies she'd spread were somehow contagious, and they wanted distance before they got caught in the blast radius. Dad just stood there looking smaller somehow, diminished, like a man who'd built his entire identity on being the respectable patriarch, only to have that image incinerated in front of everyone who'd ever looked up to him. The backstabbed feeling I'd carried for weeks was evaporating, replaced by something that felt surprisingly like pity. They'd destroyed their own reputations, isolated themselves, turned family against them, and I hadn't had to do anything except exist and tell the truth. Grandpa Henry walked over to where I sat with the twins, who were still confused, but picking up on the fact that something serious had happened, and he knelt down despite his age to look them in the eyes. He told Sophie and Daniel that their mom was the strongest, bravest person he knew, that she'd taught him something about dignity and self-worth even at 80 years old, and that they should be proud to have a mother who valued truth over comfort. The twins hugged him, and over their heads Grandpa met my eyes with this look of fierce pride mixed with sorrow. Pride in me for surviving. Sorrow that his own son had turned out to be someone capable of such calculated cruelty. He squeezed my shoulder and whispered that justice wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was just the quiet moment when everyone finally sees what you've known all along. By the time the sun started setting, maybe 20 people remained at the party, and none of them were speaking to my parents or Victoria. They'd clustered in a corner of the tent like refugees from their own event, trying to decide whether to leave or stay, whether to keep fighting or accept defeat. I gathered Sophie and Daniel, thanked Grandpa Henry for his courage, and walked toward my car with my head high and my conscience clear, knowing that I'd never have to explain myself again, never have to defend my reality against their lies, never have to wonder if I was crazy for feeling hurt by their treatment. The karma I'd been waiting for hadn't required my vengeance or my anger. It had only required the truth spoken by someone they couldn't discredit, documented evidence they couldn't deny, and an audience who finally understood that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people who were supposed to love you first, and fiercest, and forever. The weeks following Grandpa Henry's party felt like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. My parents' carefully constructed life collapsing piece by piece under the weight of consequences they'd never imagined would reach them. Word spread through the family network faster than wildfire, and suddenly the people who'd once envied their lifestyle were asking uncomfortable questions about where the money had actually come from, whether their vacations and home renovations had been funded by a daughter they'd treated like an inconvenience. Aunt Karen called me crying to apologize, admitting she'd believed their lies about my mental state because it was easier than accepting your parents could be that cruel. And I realized how many people had chosen willful blindness over uncomfortable truth simply because confronting reality required too much emotional labor. My father's reputation in their social circle imploded almost overnight. These were people who valued appearances and respectability above almost everything, and being exposed as the kind of man who'd exploit his own daughter's generosity, then abandon her during a medical emergency was social suicide in their country club world. His golf buddies stopped returning calls, dinner party invitations dried up, and I heard through Uncle James that Dad had been quietly asked to step down from the board of their neighborhood association because recent family issues had made his position untenable. The humiliation he'd tried to manufacture for me had boomeranged back with devastating precision, and part of me felt vindicated, while another part just felt exhausted by the waste of it all. If they'd simply treated me with basic human decency, none of this destruction would have been necessary. Victoria's influencer career took the hardest hit because her entire brand had been built on this image of the sweet, supportive sister navigating life's challenges with grace and authenticity. Someone, I never found out who, sent screenshots of her passive-aggressive posts about me to several of her sponsors, along with the context of what had actually been happening in our family, and 3 major brand partnerships dissolved within 2 weeks. Her follower count dropped by nearly 40%, as people realized her carefully curated authenticity was just another performance, another manipulation, another way of exploiting situations for personal gain. She tried posting a tearful video apology about family complexity and learning from mistakes, but the comments section destroyed her, full of people sharing their own stories of being scapegoated by golden child siblings who'd never faced real consequences. The financial consequences hit my parents exactly where it hurt most. Without my monthly transfers, they couldn't maintain the lifestyle they'd grown accustomed to, and within 6 weeks they'd listed their house for sale. I drove past it one afternoon and saw the for sale sign staked in the lawn I'd essentially paid for, and I felt absolutely nothing, no satisfaction, no guilt, no grief, Just this calm acceptance that actions have outcomes and adults have to live with the choices they make. Uncle James told me they were downsizing to a much smaller place outside the city, that Dad had been forced to come out of retirement to take some consulting work, that Mom had sold most of her jewelry to cover immediate expenses. The payback wasn't something I'd orchestrated or even wanted. It was simply the natural result of building a life on someone else's money and goodwill, then burning that bridge with spectacular cruelty. What surprised me most was how quickly the extended family restructured itself around the truth, rather than the lies. Christmas plans were being made that specifically excluded my parents and Victoria. Cousins were organizing gatherings and making a point to invite me and the twins. Grandpa Henry had apparently made it very clear that anyone who wanted a relationship with him needed to acknowledge what had happened and stop pretending it was just a misunderstanding. The family hadn't fractured. It had healed. Like a body finally rejecting a poison it had been tolerating for too long. I got text messages from relatives I barely knew. People sharing their own stories of how my parents had manipulated or used them over the years. Patterns of behavior that suddenly made sense when viewed through the lens of what Grandpa had exposed at that party. The most profound shift happened internally, though, in that space where I'd carried shame and self-doubt for so long, wondering if maybe I was too sensitive or demanding or ungrateful. I'd spent 8 years trying to earn love by being useful, by being the strong one, by never asking for anything in return. And all it had gotten me was exploitation and abandonment when I needed help most. Now I was redirecting every dollar I'd been sending them into college funds for Sophie and Daniel, into a savings account that would give us security instead of funding someone else's comfort, into building a life where love wasn't transactional and family wasn't a performance. The reclaiming of my own resources felt like reclaiming my dignity, my self-worth, my fundamental understanding that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting for nearly a decade. A year after Grandpa Henry's party, I stood in the living room of my new apartment. Not huge, not fancy, but ours in a way that felt sacred and earned. Watching Sophie practice piano while Daniel built an elaborate Lego city on the carpet. The sun was streaming through windows I'd chosen, in a neighborhood I'd selected, paid for with money that used to disappear into my parents' mortgage and my sister's endless emergencies. I'd been promoted to attending physician. The twins were thriving in their new school. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's expectations, or the fear that my value was measured solely by my usefulness. The freedom felt almost disorienting at first, like I'd been holding my breath for so long that actually breathing deeply required conscious effort and practice. My parents had tried reaching out a few times in those 12 months. Awkward text messages on my birthday, a card at Christmas that arrived unsigned as if they couldn't quite commit to apologizing but wanted credit for the gesture. And I'd responded to none of it. Some people in the family thought I was being harsh, that I should consider forgiveness because they're still your parents. But those people hadn't lived through 8 years of being treated as nothing more than a financial resource with a pulse. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who've shown zero genuine remorse, who've never acknowledged the harm they caused beyond vague statements about regrettable misunderstandings. And I'd learned that protecting my peace mattered more than performing reconciliation to make other people comfortable with the consequences of my parents' choices. Victoria had apparently moved back home with our parents in their smaller house, her influencer dreams deflated along with her follower count, working some administrative job that barely covered her car payment. I heard this through the family grapevine, not because I was keeping tabs, but because people still felt the need to update me, perhaps waiting to see if I'd feel vindicated or guilty, or something that would confirm their assumptions about how victims should respond to their abuser's downfall. The truth was, I felt mostly indifferent. Her life wasn't my concern anymore. Her struggles weren't my responsibility to fix. And the sister I'd thought I had probably never existed outside of my own desperate need to believe our family was normal and loving beneath the surface dysfunction. What I'd gained was so much more valuable than what I'd lost. I'd gained boundaries, self-respect, and the understanding that real family shows up when you're bleeding in an ambulance, not just when you're signing checks. Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor who'd rescued my children during my surgery, had become more family to me than my parents ever were, joining us for Sunday dinners and teaching the twins to make dumplings, while sharing stories about her own life in broken English that somehow communicated more love than my mother's perfectly articulated criticisms ever had. Rachel, the friend who'd tried to warn me years ago about my family's exploitation, had become my chosen sister, the person I called during hard moments, the one who celebrated my victories without needing them to reflect well on her own life. The twins asked about their grandparents sometimes, usually when friends at school talked about weekend visits or special outings, and I'd learned to answer honestly but age-appropriately, telling them that sometimes people aren't capable of being who we need them to be, that loving someone doesn't mean accepting treatment that hurts us, that family is built through actions and consistency rather than biology and obligation. Sophie had looked at me once with those wise 7-year-old eyes and said, "But we have Grandpa Henry and Mrs. Chen and Aunt Rachel, so we have lots of family, right?" And I'd realized my children were learning the most important lesson I could teach them, that you get to choose who deserves access to your life, your love, your energy, and your resources. Standing in that apartment with late afternoon light painting everything gold, I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, broken open on an operating table, betrayed by the people who should have protected me, desperate enough to fund her own devaluation because she couldn't imagine a world where she said no. That version of me had died somewhere between the ambulance and the recovery room, and who'd emerged was someone who understood that self-worth isn't selfish, that boundaries aren't betrayal, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who only know how to take. The peace I'd found wasn't about revenge or payback or even justice. It was about liberation, about finally understanding that I'd never been the problem. I'd just been the solution to problems that weren't mine to solve. And reclaiming my life meant accepting that some relationships aren't meant to survive the introduction of accountability and truth. So, here's what I need to know from you. Have you ever been the strong one in your family? The person everyone leaned on but nobody showed up for when you were the one bleeding? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I guarantee you're not alone in this. And sometimes just knowing other people have survived the same betrayal makes the weight a little easier to carry. What would you have done if you were in my position? Would you have cut them off immediately, or would you have given them another chance to prove they could change? And here's the question that keeps me up at night. At what point does loyalty to family become betrayal of yourself, and how do you know when you've crossed that line? I want to hear about the moments when you realized someone was exploiting your kindness, when you finally said enough, when you chose your own peace over someone else's comfort, because these stories matter. They validate experiences that too many people are told to minimize or forgive without ever receiving an apology. Have you ever had to expose a family secret to protect yourself? And if so, what happened afterward? Did people believe you? Or did they choose the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth? Tell me in the comments what boundaries you've had to set with family members, what it cost you, and whether you'd make the same choice again, knowing what you know now. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or questioned whether you were being too sensitive about treatment that was slowly destroying you from the inside out, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I share insights about family dynamics, betrayal, justice, and the messy process of reclaiming your dignity from people who never valued it in the first place. And trust me, there are more stories coming that will make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, love, and what we owe to people just because they share our DNA. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who desperately need to hear them, who need permission to prioritize themselves, who need to know that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival.